There we go. And welcome to the 2-month review, the weekly podcast from Open Letter Books and 3%, in which we take one book and break it down, talk about it bit by bit, week by week. This is Chad Post, and as always, I'm joined by Brian Wood.
Hi, Chad. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And this week we have special guest Ellen Elias-Bursac. How are you doing, Ellen?
I'm good, thanks.
For anyone, before we get too far into this, for anyone who tried to watch the YouTube video from a couple weeks ago, if you haven't noticed, we've been on hiatus. Something went wrong while I was in Ireland. It did not record correctly. It recorded about 1 minute or maybe it was 4 minutes of the conversation, and then played it at like triple speed. So I'm not sure what happened. I blame it on leprechauns and Irish folklore. But so we decided, rather than try and keep risking like having something go wrong when I'm in Ireland, and we're trying to do this over 3 continents, more or less, or 3 countries at least, we'd wait a couple weeks and come back and record everything again and get going again with the whole program. So today we'll be talking about the second half of The Balancing Act, which is the part 2 of Ugresic Fox. Covers pages, I think, 76 through 106, or something to that effect. But before we get into that, yesterday was the World Cup final, in which Croatia lost tragically 4-2. And Ellen, you are still in Zagreb, so you are witnessing something amazing, I guess.
Well, you know, I feel as if I don't really, if people keep writing to me and saying, wow, it's so great that you're there and all this. And sure, it is amazing to be here and see this whole thing, but I don't really feel it was hardly my accomplishment. Anyway, But no, it's really been, I mean, it was amazing today. At 9 o'clock in the morning, I went into the main square to meet somebody for coffee, and already there were people beginning to gather, and the players flew into the airport at Zagreb at 3:30 this afternoon with a MiG jet escort on either side of them. They flew over the main square with the jet escort, and then they came into the airport, and then they came down, and all the way from the airport into town, which is not a small route, there have been people along the way, and they still haven't gotten to the main square. And there was some concern they might not even be able to get into the main square because there's so many people that the roads are all filled all around the main theater and then all around the main street going into the main square. It's all solid humanity. So I figure about a quarter of Croatia is here. I mean, of course, there are some people who come from elsewhere, so they're adding to the crowd, but mostly it's Croats, and I'd say just about 1 million people. So that's a quarter of the country.
Just imagine if you guys were winners. Oh my goodness.
Well, you know,
no, I'm kidding.
Everybody was saying after the previous game that they could lose. It wasn't a big deal because they were second. I mean, people were going to lose their second place.
Yeah.
So, and they played really well, I thought. I watched most of the games during the World Cup, and I thought they played beautiful soccer. So that was nice. It wasn't bulldozer soccer. It was pretty soccer.
Yeah, I like their team. I like them in Belgium the best.
Out the American way is if we're not going to win at all, we're just not going to even show up, you know.
Well, I mean, the World Cup hasn't really been decided yet because they haven't played the U.S. yet. So once France plays the U.S. next week, they don't know who the real champion of the world is.
Counts. Yeah.
Oh man! But we should talk a little bit.
Welcome back from Ireland. Looks like you got your Protestant shirt on today. So you're.
I never once wore orange while I was there, just in case.
If you're not watching,
Chad
has a very vibrant orange polo shirt on. So
you're lucky. You're lucky I have a shirt on. This was here in my office because I rode my bike in and forgot most of my clothes, and headphones and everything else. Today's not been the best days, but you know we're here. So Ellen, let's talk about Fox. But before that, for anyone who doesn't know, you've translated a number of important authors from the former Yugoslavia, including Dubravka Ugresic, Baba Yaga Laid an Egg, Nobody's Home, now Fox, Slavenka Draculic, I believe is how you pronounce it, is another Dasha Jernic, Trieste that came out a few years ago. And then from the Serbian side of things, David El-Bahari is being one of the main ones, of which you've translated, I guess, I'm looking at this now, 6 different books of his?
I think six, a number of novels and a couple of books of short stories. And also from Igor Štix, who, you know, is one of those people who evades pigeonholing. So you might say he's from Croatia, you might say he's from Serbia, you might say he's from Bosnia, and all those things would be true. So,
which sort of fits into talking about Dubravka too, because we keep talking about Croatia mainly because of the World Cup, because that is was a nice segue. They weren't necessarily expected to make it to the final, but it's fun to sort of follow them as we've been talking about this book. But she is like a writer that transcends all these boundaries and has lived I don't know if it's most of her life, but a lot of her adult career as a writer, she's been not living in Croatia per se, and has been much more of a global European author, which is very true within Fox and within a lot of her books, where she's not talking about Croatia per se, except in the regards to like being in exile from it, but more talking about literature on a global scale, and things like immigration in this chapter. So one thing I wanted to ask you is, you said before when we were setting this all up that this was the section you most wanted to talk about because this was the section that was your favorite. So you take it away and tell us what you like the best about A Balancing Act. Well,
and besides, right off the bat, it's not a balancing act; it's a balancing art.
Sorry, I said that.
Okay, no, but I mean that's that's pertinent just because. Well, in a way, it's pertinent to your question, but it's also something that you'd brought up in one of the earlier podcasts about. So, what is this? Why is it called a balancing art? And it was in the Croatian, it would have been the art of the balance, and we could have gone with that. That's a nice title, but I really liked A Balancing Art because I just thought it gave it a little life, and it was kind of engaging as a title and surprising. But I think it also works well for this chapter and for what I like about this chapter, which is she has the chapter is about her acquaintance with a widow of a great writer, and that's introduced in the first half, and the widow is introduced, and they're on a panel together, and they at a conference in Naples, and then they walk around Naples, and they go to various museums, and on the way they talk about literature. And what I found so engaging about this, and then there's a little interpolation of a previous story that she builds on that actually was introduced in Nobody's Home, and then she develops further in this chapter. And in both that story and the main story with the widow, this balancing thing is going on. And I think that at least that's for me sort of what she's up to, that she's got these two characters talking about art. And one of them is this older, wiser woman in her 80s. And the other is the young, in the first part, this young writer who's frustrated and feels she's not being taken seriously, and that the people in the audience at the panel were listening only to the older widow because she was kind of a celebrity, being the widow of this famous male writer, and that made her more important than the younger woman who is a writer in her own right, so to speak, who was feeling neglected and not taken seriously. And in a way, what I found so fascinating in this, first of all, I loved the portrait of the widow. She was done with such sweetness and complexity in a way that I found very engaging. But also she's the older Dubravka talking to the younger Dubravka in the form of the narrator of the chapter. And it's sort of, she's the older, wiser, in a sense. I mean, that's one piece of it. She's also the widow, somebody who has had to forego her own creativity to support a man, as opposed to the younger writer who is speaking with her own voice and frustrated because no one's taking her seriously. So it's about, in a way, this chapter is also about this question of how to be a strong woman writer and how to create a voice as a woman writer. And I think it's done with real skill. But I just want to read, because I just love it, the way she describes the widow in this wonderful description on page 64 that I just loved when I was translating it. So it says, "The widow breathed a genteel charm, as if she had just stepped out of a BBC adaptation of some great English classic, a more sensual version of Maggie Smith. She had thick gray hair plaited in a short braid that she wore down her back like a bashful high school girl. Curls poked out in all the right places around her ears, softening her face and making the wrinkles less pronounced. Yes, she had wrinkles after all. She was over 80. Her teeth were just slightly crooked, but they were still hers, and they were all there. Her face was well put together. the only trace of makeup, the discreet strikes of eyeshadow on her eyelids. Her hands were angular, wrinkled, scattered with liver spots, and tanned as if she gardened. And her posture was elegant. Her back was age-wise, surprisingly straight. Her nose was slightly hooked, and so forth. And I just find that an enormously touching description, and one just sort of radiating affection. And it's just, so in what happens later then becomes all the more dramatic, because later on they go for a walk after they've been to a museum and they've seen various things, and they come out and they're talking, and the widow says to her, the people, this is, no, I don't have the page number here, but it must be around page 80 or 79. I owe you an apology for our performance together on the panel. The people yesterday came to see me, not you. This is the widow talking to the young writer. I'm so sorry about that, especially because defeat could be read on your face. Your chin quivered. You were on the verge of tears. I'm sorry, but I'm guessing this is not the first time this has happened to you. And it's, again, it's moving to hear the narrator being described in this vulnerable way. I mean, it's just very touching. The whole relationship between the two of them was what I really loved in this chapter. And then the widow tells her, through women, men find their way to other men. And I just thought that was a really interesting statement. Just a second.
That's the sound of all the people in the streets, I assume.
No, that's my laundry spinner.
Or
I'm going back to the States on Friday, and I'm doing my clothes here. But so this whole notion of sort of defending women's voices against men, and the whole business that the popularity of a writer, or in this case, a man's widow, is all about men talking to each other. I just found that really interesting.
Yeah, that one is one of my favorite lines. Is page 89. Women long to converse, she said. This is a hunger we felt for centuries. Not so with men. They're forever in conversation with other men, of course.
Yes. I mean, it's and you guys had mentioned that scene in Pompeii where there's a penis carved on and all the men are kind of having this funny reaction to it, and it's very, very funny. And I think she's kind of discarding men at that stage in this chapter. I mean, it's like out with the men, on with something else now.
Yeah, something idolizing the things that you can depend on the least when she's looking at a phallus. It's just like it's such a great line. So funny.
Yeah, right.
It really is.
Yeah.
And again, in this same thing about her being critical of the younger writer, she says, you're besotted with your own voice and you neglect to keep an eye on the things around you. This is also page 89. You think the beauty of your voice suffices. Everybody will hear it, and it's your job to sing. Yet you yourself know things don't work that way. And meanwhile, you're no fox. The fox is most definitely not your totem. And so that line, I mean, in a way, you have to believe, because this narrator is always dipping in and out of Dubravka's life, that Dubravka is able to speak of herself that way. I mean, it's really quite powerful.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Bringing her vulnerability into the chapter.
And it's such a surprising relationship they have with that whole balancing part, because you don't expect the way she's like, the way you read the description, being so kind of like kind and elderly, but then she's just kind of acerbic and kind of cuts right to the heart of things. No nonsense. These really long paragraphs are just like, here's your problem. You're this, like, just like disrobing somebody, like a young person, like, you need to grow up here. You know, it's a really interesting relationship.
Well, yes, and again, and she kind of explains that transition in The Widow when she gives the piece about Marlene that comes later in the chapter.
Yeah.
Marlene comes and is telling her about her attempts at setting up her company, and she's performing on stilts, and she's got all these ideas. And then the narrator in that segment is being the older, sardonic, angry person.
Yeah.
And Marlene is being the vulnerable young artist who is trying to defend herself against the same sort of thing that we saw the younger writer defending herself with the widow, and she says quite indicatively on page 96, I don't know why, perhaps because of the smokescreens Marlene needed to obscure her genuine state of affairs. Rage instead of pity stirred in me. Rage is another form of sympathy. And I think in that sentence is the whole key to the widow's sharpness with her, that she took it as caring. Mm-hmm. Even if it was critical, she took it as caring, and she responded with real love. I mean, that's what you feel through this whole passage, is this great affection. And so and then she gives more. I mean, after all, also the stilts are kind of a balancing thing too, which
I really like too, yeah.
And then she says, just below what I just read before, she says, all in all, I said something, lashed out with harsh words at Marlene's invisible stilts. I don't even remember what. The tone mattered more than the words. A tone Marlene understood. My tone sent her swaying like a crystal goblet. She looked as if she might shatter, but she didn't make a sound or cry. Instead, she spat out something like, I do what I know the best I can. And then she got up and left. And so she's talking out of, you say this in Croatian, of both sides of her mouth. I mean, she's speaking, seeing herself as Marlene and herself as the widow in that situation, and it's really interesting the way she pulls that off.
Oh, absolutely. I think this is a really well, I mean, all of her books are really well crafted, and they require you to pay attention and ask you to like think about things and sort of pick up on different clues, and also hold different viewpoints in your mind at the various points. Like, it would be one way to, there's no simple way to interpret this. I mean, there is, but like you could buy into the younger author against the widow and being like, yes, she should be able to say what she wants and to take her own stance and to write that way. And then it becomes complicated through the widow and through that secondary level, like you say, of her kind of transitioning closer to the widow. So you keep the idea of like the perspective keeps shifting as this goes along, and all kind of ties back in towards the first part with like the creation of the idea of how to write, how stories become stories, and how you start to process that. And it makes, I mean, it's why Dubravka is one of the greatest writers that's working today, is because it is so rich and so deep, and yet every line just feels so smooth to read, and like you could just go right past it and not notice all these different little levels that are at work and at play in here.
There's another on page 98. She kind of makes the full circle about this business of her, about who is she? Is she Marlene or is she the widow? And she says, I was blindsided by the realization that I myself am a stilt walker, but less skilled and far older than Marlene. And hey, I do what I know the best I can. So she keeps doing this shift back and forth in this really interesting way. And then you get into this interesting and playful end of the chapter with a whole series of little, what are they? I don't have it. Epilogues, right. And where she sort of puts everything into a mythical perspective, and Greek myth and women. And anyway, I was fascinated by that. And then she comes back to the widow at the end of it.
Yes. I thought that that part was really fascinating too. In terms of like that story, where is it? Now
105.
Is it 105? 105 is the widow part. Yeah, the 108 is the one I think I'm thinking of. Oh, okay. Where it changed. It changed the character, the Greek female character into Saint Patricia, and like sort of defanged and made her different as a figure of worship. And like a lot of this chapter has to do with like women's voices and where they're powerful or not. Like even going back, the widow says something to the effect of, where is it? I know it's pretty early on. It's on 77. Men value me. Why? Because I know my place. Obediently, I served and facilitated the literary career of a man. I served the mind of a man. I am therefore a dream woman for many men. I am also their dream widow. And that sort of like using that as a perspective, and then using that as like the perspective to give advice to a younger woman, is running the risk of being like a dangerous idea. And yet it's because it's so much more nuanced than that, it makes this chapter work so well.
Yeah, she's long been really interested in situations like, for example, Danilo Kish, when he died. I forget whether it was one of his former wives or his most recent wife before he died, who devoted the rest of her life to promoting his work. And this is a theme she's talked about a lot of times with a lot of different writers. And she's often joked about, who's going to be my person who's going to devote their life to promoting my work after I go. So she's thought about this.
Super ironically, one of the people that was on this trip to Ireland with me, right after we tried to record this last time and it didn't work, two things happened. I went and saw a play version of Ulysses, which does sort of bump up against this, and the idea of like Stephen versus Leopold as two different versions of like being human and being a creative. And then also one of the women on the trip was talking about how one of her good friends from high school was the last wife of Kenneth Rexroth, and he passed away shortly after they got married, and she became the widow in charge of the entire estate. And it was this exact situation that played out. She's like, she was never really, she published a book of poems, but really it was his foreword that got it published. And like now, she's in charge of his whole estate, and that's her thing. So it's interesting to see that come to life immediately.
Right. Well, it is. I mean, it is an interesting dimension of the sort of male writer versus female writer situation, although it could, I suppose, go the other way with a husband who devotes the rest of his life to promoting his wife's work, and there may be instances of that, but it's certainly not what one thinks of first.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of that right now, and I'm coming up blank on a husband that goes around trying to promote his
what about Iris
work.
Murdoch? I suppose Iris Murdoch, I mean, she was demented and her husband looked after her, and I don't know how much he devoted himself to her work, but I know that film. I saw the film about this.
Oh, interesting. I haven't seen that. I've been thinking about her too, because she's Irish.
Of course.
I've only read a few of her books like many years ago. It is sort of weird coming out of Ireland, out of like months of preparing to give 4 lectures and reading all these Irish books, and now it's like I don't have to. I can read other things again, and I don't know what to do. Like I'm overwhelmed.
Well, I've got a couple good Irish books you might like.
That's what it feels like. I'm like running on habit at this moment in time. So we did talk. You mentioned the fox section in here. So this chapter's fox appearance comes on page 89, where she says, "A man besotted." This is the widow talking. A man besotted with his own voice is on his way home from fishing, carrying the fish he caught in a bag on his back, and singing with gusto. By the road, he spots a dead fox, scoops it up, and drops it into the bag. The fox, which is only playing dead, eats the fish along the way, then wriggles free of the bag and goes bounding off. The man, besotted with his voice, continues along his way with no fish and no fox in it. You're besotted with your own voice, and you neglect to keep an eye on the things around you. Which then leads into the section you quoted. You think the beauty of your voice suffices, everyone will hear it, and it's your job to sing. So this is where the fox appears in this chapter, and in the way of telling the younger author that she's not fox-like, that she's not cunning, and she's not deceitful in that way, or like hiding within the sort of enterprise as it exists and taking away the treasure from within, and instead just saying like, well, I can sing too. I can be like this person. I can have my voice, and that directly not working.
Right, and sort of that she's naive, that she believes that if she creates something beautiful, people will just come to her, build the field and they will come, sort of, and it doesn't work that way.
But it's okay to keep believing in that idea even when you're like 50, right? Like it'll all change at some point, right?
Well, doesn't this also come out of basically her hearing the young author speak at the panel they're on together, right? She's like searching to try to say the right things, not really being true to herself. She's not comfortable enough yet to be truthful.
Well, or just that people aren't really listening to her because the stuff she's saying is too sincere and too genuine, and it doesn't intrigue them. It's sort of just naive, and she feels that that's enough, just to be sort of an artist is enough, and that she doesn't have to kind of position herself and be deliberate about what she does.
Because it makes me think, like after that little fox parable that she gives her, then on 90s, briefly right after on 97, when she's seeing Marlene, I like that, I I could so easily have had said a few words about how marvelous it was, the things she was doing, and she goes on and she's like, I didn't say any of that. Like the younger her would have been like, oh, that's really wonderful. Your art's great. Like, we got to pursue our art. That's wonderful to do. Like, you know, all the encouragement that you would would want to give another artist. But no, the older changed artist doesn't do that at all.
Well, and then there is this wonderful, touching thing at the very end, very emotional. And I think that that's another piece that I really like about this chapter, is that it's so emotional. I mean, it's so much, in a way, well, it's a different set of emotions than the next chapter, which is a whole other set of issues. But it's just very personal. It's very personal to, I would say, to Dubravka Ugresic, and I think that that's really, it's really important that she showed that kind of vulnerability. But at the end of it, on page 109, after she's talking about how the widow has died and she's learned, and there's this, as you mentioned last week, there's this mystery of where the widow died and which city she lived in, which is hilarious. And then she's very moved thinking about the widow, and she says, in my mind's ear, provoked by nothing at all, words of the widow suddenly chimed like a jangling nervous bell. From time to time, I would feel a misplaced, this is the widow speaking. Mm-hmm. From time to time, I would find a misplaced poem, story, or a page from his diary. He was a master at misplacing his things. Have I told you that already, Lalcom? Tears trickled down my cheeks. So she's remembering the widow, saying that the widow would come across things that she had never seen before of the author, her husband, and then she'd bring them out and publish them. And in fact, the implication here is that the widow had actually written those things, that it's her own writing. And this is the only way that she can actually promote herself, is hiding it under as if it were something that she'd found of her late husband's, that she could then promote. And I studied the pictures of her. It goes on to say, I studied the pictures of her on the computer screen, her eyes slightly slanted, the color of honey, which is the way she's described throughout. Watch me with taut attention, precisely as if I were her potential prey. And then, perhaps because of my tears, her eyes seemed to slant even more, as if she were choking back laughter or a sob. And I switched off the computer. And it's this, all the complexities of, or the sadness of that particular woman's voice being lost to her devotion to promoting her husband. It's very touching. It's very touching.
It's amazing. And that is that sort of implication of her getting her own writing out through Levin is sort of being the fox inside the
fox. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Right. It's really wonderful way of reintroducing that in a new form. Very foxy, very foxy.
Celebration of betrayal. Great. Yeah. This is another one that, like, there's always, one of my favorite parts of Dubravka's writing is the sort of relationship to the idea of literary celebrities and celebrity as a whole. Like, that shows up a lot throughout Thank You for Not Reading, Karaoke Culture, Europe and Sepia less so, I think. But it's always kind of there in the background of, like, why certain things get chosen or are promoted in a certain way. Like, there's that great, I think is it in Thank You for Not Reading, where she's like going, how everyone on the beach, no matter where you go in the world, everyone's reading like The Alchemist or Foucault's Pendulum on the beach, it doesn't matter what country you are, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, everyone's reading the same book. Why this like book? And there's a great bit in there too that like the New York Times bestseller list is just like Soviet realism for America, because it tells you exactly how to write your stories in one particular pattern that will appeal to everyone. Joe always resists that and like is anti that, and that shows up here a little bit with I mean, they talk about celebrity a bit, but one of my favorite quotes is on 77, which says, literary life is exciting only when you're at your desk between four walls. All else evokes a feeling of defeat, both human and professional, if serious writing can even be deemed a profession. And then literature lovers do adore their celebrities, which I just love that part of like that realization of like, it's great, and then, you know, not. That's hard, and that that celebrity is not based on merit.
You get that a little bit too in some of the more kind of cutting, just quick descriptions she gives of folks attending the conference. She has like very funny descriptions.
Little quippy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if there's anything else I was going to bring up in here, I have all these notes from the last time we did it, but they're all illegible now because my handwriting is the worst. Like, I don't know if anyone's saying like that's not even English.
Well, I think we shared our favorite lines and then ended with a really interesting book that she just wrote.
Oh, I know what. There was one other point. There was one other point that I wanted to include in here that I can read because I don't know which page it is though. Is that this is one of the times that the idea of the footnote comes up? Yeah, it's 91, and this was one of the key points in relation to the widow talking to the younger author. So the young author, or the widow says, "How old you are, and yet you haven't come clean with yourself about a few of the basics. Would you, for instance, rather dream about a work of art than create it? Do you imagine yourself taking part in literature as a footnote that can be easily dropped or an indispensable work of art?" And that sort of motif recurs later on too of like, am I someone who's creating art or am I someone who'd rather dream about it? And that's an interesting point that I think we went into that a lot last time.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. I mean, this whole business of the footnote is huge throughout this whole novel. Well, let me just give a footnote to the novel itself, which is that I'm in Zagreb. I've been here since February on a Fulbright teaching at the university. So I've had a chance to spend a lot of time with Dubravka Ugresic, and also had the great pleasure of being present in at an award ceremony about 3 weeks ago when she was given the T. Portal Literary Award in Zagreb, which is a not insignificant sum of money, and but more importantly, it's one of the big awards that's given in Croatia, and it was just a wonderful thing to actually see her work being recognized in Croatia. I may be wrong, but it's my impression that this is the first time she's received any acknowledgement of in the form of some kind of an award or whatever since the war. I mean, it's been that was I mean, since 1990 when the war began. Before that, she'd received almost every award you could get in Yugoslavia, the Need Award and various others for her work. She was really highly regarded, and then suddenly, because not so surprisingly, because of her position in criticizing not only the government, but also her colleagues and the members of the intellectual community who were not standing up to the negative aspects of sort of nationalism and so forth that were going on around them. Even if they didn't like them, they weren't speaking out about them openly enough, and she was very upset about that. So this went on for a long time. I mean, it's been a long time since 1990. It's been 18 years, and she's been writing all kinds of terrific books, particularly, I mean, the Museum of Unconditional Surrender and some of these others that are real masterpieces. And so it was very gratifying, and she was, I think, gratified. She was happy. She did. I went to later to an interview, kind of an interview that people were invited to at a bookstore called Buksa in Zagreb. Absolutely packed. I mean, you couldn't walk in the door. I had to leave after half an hour because of some obligations, but I was just very impressed. I don't know how many people were there. It's a small space, but she started out by saying that one of the major Zagreb newspapers, Jutarnji List, had, they couldn't not comment on the fact that she'd received the award. It was too important in a lot of ways. It wasn't just, this is a person who received an award. It was Dubravka Ugresic receiving an award. And so they, at the bottom of a column in a little additional piece, they wrote in a few lines saying, well, we here at Jutarnji List are glad to see that Dubravka Ugresic received this award. And then they had to have the caveat. So they said, however, even though she has distanced herself from Croatian culture in many ways in her writing, still we're glad to see that she received the award. So she read this to the assembled group at this bookstore and said, begrudging would be the adjective to describe. Is this recording?
Yeah, it's all fine. That's someone just called me and I tried to turn it off.
But anyway, so she was commenting on the begrudging, and she also said that her name turned up in a crossword puzzle in the Rijeka newspaper, and she felt that in communism, if your name turned up in a crossword puzzle, you were sort of being written off or something, like it was over for you. It was about crossword puzzles in her name, but I don't know how far I can go with that one, but I was amused about the little piece at the end of the column.
So one of the takeaways then, like, so it's possible then that if you're disagreeing with the academic community, you might become ostracized by academia? that can happen?
Very surprising.
Oh dear.
No, I mean, that was her biggest, that was the biggest reason that she had difficulties. I mean, she criticized.
The government I completely understand, but yeah, and it happens so much here too. It's insane.
Her colleagues and friends, and I think that, you know, always take that too well. So
that's why Chad and I always agree with whatever the smart folks are saying, and you know what, you're right.
That's why we're really popular here. Yeah, so I have a general question for you, and then I want to get into your book. But one thing I didn't mention in the beginning is that you're the vice president currently of Alta, and you will be the president. You're the incoming president, essentially, and your presidency starts this fall or next fall?
Next fall.
Next fall. Okay.
Away, yeah.
Which coincidentally, the Alta conference where you start as president will be here in Rochester, so you will take over right from here. So I mean, if anyone doesn't know about Alta, it's an organization for literary translators. The annual conference is one of the kind of keystones of the whole organization, and is a great place for anyone who's interested in becoming a translator, connecting with other translators, learning about any number of different things. And on that note, was there anything about your process of translating Fox that you feel like you learned as a translator, or something that was a good lesson for you?
Well, the thing that's really a challenge, and it's always been a challenge with Dubravka's writing, is that she writes in this particularly kind of snappy voice, sort of quippy, snappy voice, but she's also writing about really dark and profound things at the same time. And so keeping those two kinds of energy working together in her writing is what I think about when I'm working on her writing. And so you don't want it to be too cliched, but she's always hovering right on the edge of cliche. I mean, there's kind of she plays with cliche all the time in her writing, and you want to get that across, but you don't want it to sound as if she's a cliched, shallow writer, because she's anything but that. So that's she's very dark and yet very funny. And I think that for me, that's what I appreciate the most in writing. Particularly, I've spent a lot of my career as a literary translator translating about war, because there's been a lot of conflict in the part of the world that I am working from. So the writers I admire the most, whose work I've found the most gratifying to translate, are those who find a way to bring together humor and tragedy in ways that are always compelling and energize their prose. And I think she would be a perfect example of that. There are a few others as well.
I love this very subtle line. I thought was so funny on page 75, where it says, "The kind organizers not only changed my flight, but they moved me from the expensive hotel for which they had been paying to an inexpensive bed and breakfast for which I would pay." So just setting that all up with the kind organizers, right? Like, but it's just a nice little like jab, like, you know.
There's always things like that going on.
Oh man! So let's do favorite lines, and then let's talk about your book.
Okay. Well, gee, I think you asked me favorite lines last time, and I wasn't prepared for it, but oh gee, you guys do favorite lines.
You go first, Brian. I'm trying to find where mine is.
Sure. I know what yours is. Yours is always like the nihilistic.
I know. I'm trying to find it.
I know where it is. There's a big box around it on my book. We were talking about footnotes earlier. I like this line about footnotes on page 102. It is not me, of course, that matters. It's the footnote. The footnote is a form of survival.
Ah,
That's
right.
a kind of dark, frightening line that I can really understand with.
And for my weekly dose of nihilism, page 101, the only thing unambiguous and constant is loss. Every person, one way or another, is always losing. We all slide downhill. What matters is only our skill at slowing things down, a skill demonstrated by the orange tree that grows out of the sidewalk at nearby Van San Sebastiano and pelts car roofs and nosy motorcyclists with its fruit.
There's that dark humor again, right?
I'm going to leap out and say I don't. Okay, I'm reading the last line here of the chapter before she gets into the epilogues. I faded from Naples like color, blending through the airplane window with the blue of the Bay of Naples, which she gives in Italian, and with scent. The customs official's wonder of wonders did let me pass after all with my pot of basil that lay in my lap throughout the flight. Oh, I know, that's the one I gave as, oh shoot, where is it? Basil. I don't know. I don't think I can find it, but there was something about a pot of basil that she buys, and I really loved that. I'm sorry. I'm not prepared for this.
I'm trying to find it too. I do remember that, but I can't remember where it is in here.
Oh well, no, it's at that same paragraph.
Yeah.
She says, at every jostle, even the slightest, the basil, berserk, exuded its heavy scent. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. And I love that line.
That is a great line.
Talking with a friend of mine about the word berserk after
berserk is so interesting in there. That's very unexpected.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. We worked. I just had a discussion with a friend of mine over that.
But even that's kind of a humorous image to picture somebody sitting with a potted plant and it's shaking and they're just smelling these wonderful memories as the.
Yeah. Well, and the basil is kind of almost like a poet or an artist or something. Yeah. There's this kind of crazy heady scent, and it's berserk, and it's, I don't know. I mean, it's all about the balancing art or something.
That does remind me a bit too of like the Russian formalists, who I think Dubravka is sort of influenced by. I mean, she talks about Shklovsky a lot, and a lot of those, and that sort of way of recontextualizing words that are out of use or making them be used in context with things that they usually aren't, with nouns or with different situations, does show up a lot in here. And that's usually kind of where those great points come from, is that the little hint of that sort of writing.
Yeah, the kind of dramatic language.
Yeah.
Language drama.
So tell us about your new book, which I think is fascinating. And I think everyone listening to this will be really captivated by too.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to say some words about it. I worked at the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague for 6.5 years in the language translation unit, and I was completely fascinated by the fact that translation everything that went on at the court went on through translation. The evidence that was being tendered, they were all translated documents. They were on screens in front of everybody in the courtroom. On the left-hand side, the original. On the right-hand side, the translation produced by my department. And everybody was talking about the relationship between the original and the translation in every session of court. There were over 10,800 sessions of court in the 24 years of the tribunal, with their 3 courtrooms and morning and afternoon sessions. And in those more than 10,000 sessions, translation came up every single time, every single session, at least several times in the course of the 3.5-hour session. So it just was an incredibly productive, especially because the transcripts give every open session of court. So you've got 1 million pages of transcripts in English, 1 million pages in French that were taken real time in the courtroom from the English stream. And I was able to use those transcripts and find situations that were interesting to talk about related to translation from those transcripts. And I just found it was incredibly productive. There was all kinds of really interesting material. And what I ended up focusing on was how the parties, that means the prosecution and the defense, and chambers, used translation to achieve their various ends in the courtroom.
Mm-hmm.
The prosecution would use translation. They'd say a word that was tricky, that sort of defied translation because it was perhaps a little obfuscating a reality that was tricky on the ground and that the people in the documents didn't want to name directly. So they were using these kind of words to camouflage what was going on the ground. So the prosecution would go after witnesses, particularly witnesses who were being cross-examined. In other words, witnesses for the defense, who would come, and then they say, well, wait a minute, what does this word mean? What were these people actually doing if they were doing this? And then the defense witnesses being cross-examined would end up talking about, sort of exposing the meaning of things through this discussion of how that word could be translated and what it meant. So that was the prosecution's approach to things. Then the defense were the most frequent in using translation. They used translation to distract attention from their clients who were sitting in the courtroom, who were, many of them, really well-known people for what they had done. And it wasn't as if some of them were on TV doing it. I mean, it wasn't as if there was any secret for a lot of them what they'd been up to during the war. So they were trying to, the way I think about it is they were trying to reduce war crimes to a dispute about terminology. Oh, so instead of saying these terrible things happened, wait a minute, is it that word or this word? So there was a lot of that kind of thing that went on in the courtroom and a lot of disputing. That's not the way I'd like to say it. I'd like to say it. And a lot of times people trying in the defense, particularly when people who were actual war criminals defended themselves in the courtroom without an attorney, there were situations where they would try to put words in the mouth of the interpreters working in the booth. They would say, well, I hear that the interpreter just translated this way, but I think it should be translated that way. And then you'd have these little dueling sessions going on, which are all in the transcripts, where they try to say, this should be this. And then in the transcript, it'll read the interpreter who's being criticized is interpreting that too, and says, this should be this or that, and continues adding what it is that the person pressuring them is trying to have them not say. So there were constant these battles over language going on. And then the court, the chamber, would use translation for a variety of things. For example, they would turn to the interpreters to ask their advice if there were disputes over terms in the courtroom that could be easily resolved. They would also sometimes make little jokes about, for example, one of the big problems that came up, as you might well imagine, is that people would speak too quickly, especially if the attorney and the witness spoke the same language. Whichever language. I mean, that often happened with Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian, but also with other languages as well. And so then they get into this back and forth, this very rapid exchange of back and forth, and the interpreters can't follow it. And even if they could, the transcriber has to be able to get it all down. And even though they could type 300 words a minute, still sometimes this stuff would go so fast that it was hard for them to catch up. And then if they couldn't keep up, the judges didn't know what was going on because they couldn't follow it since they were following everything through what the booth said. So there's this whole culture developed in the courtroom of phrases the judges use to get people to speak more slowly. And there's a whole kind of culture around. And so then they've developed this kind of jokey thing. And I realized after a while, for some judges in particular who were there for a long time and got really used to this, that they would make little jokes to put people at their ease, because after all, a war crimes tribunal is not an easy situation. And so sometimes this would kind of lighten up the atmosphere. Like, for example, an attorney would apologize for having spoken too quickly, and the judge would say, sir, if you apologize, that's one more thing that they have to translate in the booth. Your apology on top of everything else. Or there were lots of these little kind of quips that they developed to sort of have it be have a little levity as a result of some of these difficulties. And I have a favorite line from that I've always been very that I really loved after I found it, where this fellow had been an interpreter in the field and had been interpreting over a telephone conversation with one of the accused, and it may have been a situation that this is Dokmanovic of Vukovar, may have been a situation that this accused didn't realize that there was an indictment out against him. He was still at liberty. He hadn't been arrested yet. And the point was, in the courtroom, they were trying to ascertain how much he understood that he was speaking to an investigator, because it's against the rules of the tribunal, rules of procedure, to be investigating someone if they don't realize they're being investigated. So they have to be able to be informed of their rights and so forth. So they're asking the translator who interpreted the conversation over the phone, "Sir, is that exactly what he said?" Which is always a funny thing to ask a translator. So the translator answered, "Sir, that is verbatim what he said, just through me and in other words." So I've always really loved that. I thought that was just a great description of what we do.
That is spectacular. That is spectacular. You know, one thing we left out, though, is what is the name of the book?
Oh, of course. It's got a ridiculous name, and I apologize in advance for it. So my name for the book was Working in a Tug of War. I wanted to have it be Working in a Tug of War, : Translating Evidence and Interpreting Testimony at a War Crimes Tribunal. That was my idea. But they said at Palgrave Macmillan, this is this academic publisher, that you have to put the descriptive title first, which I think is ridiculous, because it's easier for people to find it online. And so the book is called Translating Evidence and Interpreting Testimony at a War Crimes Tribunal, : Working in a Tug of War. I mean, it's just a little lopsided. The whole thing is just a little lopsided, but that's what it's called.
That's so funny. I feel like that title should be reversed. I agree with you.
I believe. Thank you. I believe. That's my feeling too.
But it's available. We'll have links to it in the show notes. But it is one of these academic books, like you say, so it's fairly expensive. I forget how much it is right now, but it's up there.
And you can get it cheaper as an ebook. But I recommend everybody just ask their library to get a copy, and then because it's way too expensive for actual mortals to pay for it.
Yeah, $14.95 is asking a lot sometimes. So, but yeah, so we'll include a link so everyone can go bug their libraries and get the book into libraries and then check it out.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Perfect. I think it sounds fascinating, and I think people listening to this are going to really jump on that, because it does get to the core of a lot of things that viewers and fans of the show and of Open Letter and 3% in general really like talking about. And they hear someone that had such interesting experience with that get into all those different issues is really going to be it's fantastic.
Well, think of the stakes. Like, this isn't like your weekend workshop for a short story. We're talking about war criminals, murderers.
Who were reading our translations in the courtroom. I mean, they were poring over every sentence, seeing anything that they could complain about, that we gave them the opportunity to complain about. And even things that they couldn't complain about, they complained about anyway. Yeah. So, anyway.
Yeah, of course. Well, thanks again for joining us, and for joining us twice. and this, from everything I can see, recorded perfectly fine. So
okay, great.
And I look forward to seeing you in Rochester, hopefully.
Washing machine, which is unfortunately imposing itself.
It's not that bad. It's not that bad. So yeah, so as always, you can follow us at 3%. You can sign up to the YouTube channel. It's under 2-month review. Brian's online as Brian at Twitter at BrianWood_. I'm Chad W. Post. Open Letter is open_letter. You can find all the information you want about all the upcoming shows there. We will hopefully be back next week, although, again, complications, so there'll be an announcement. But the next episode will be going over the first half of part 3 of the book, which is called The Devil's Garden, and it'll be covering pages 110 through 144, the first 9 sections of that part. So get on board. Stephen Sparks from Point Reyes Books will be joining us to talk about that, hopefully. And I don't have anything else to add.
Well, thanks a lot. It was fun.
Thank you. Oh, wait, Ellen, are you on Twitter too? Or are you? No, I didn't think so. Okay, good. You're smart. Stay away. And I think that's all for this week. So thanks everyone for listening, and we will talk to you again soon.
Okay, bye-bye.